Okay, let's start. Number 8. The Griffin. Gold lay exposed in the ground far to the north, in the mountains beyond Scythia, and something with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle stood over it, tearing apart anyone who came close. Herodotus wrote the story down in the 5th century BCE, secondhand, and admitted he didn't fully believe it himself. The people said to live nearest to gold, the one-eyed Aramaspians, fought the creatures constantly, stealing what they could while the Guardians tore at them. Herodotus traced the account back to an earlier poet, Aristeas of Proconnesus, who claimed to have traveled the region himself generations before. The story didn't stay with one writer. Cetheus repeated it in the 4th century BCE. Pliny the Elder recorded a version of it in the 1st century CE, 400 years after Aristeas. Across every retelling, the same specific details survive without drifting. 4 legs, a beaked head, a guarded gold seam, a one-eyed enemy tribe. The physical record backs this up too. Soviet archaeologists excavating the frozen Pazyryk burial mound in Siberia's Altai Mountains between 1947 and 1949 recovered felt saddle covers and gold plaques stamped with griffin figures buried alongside Scythian riders. This creature lived outside the text too. Wherever Scythian culture left remains, griffin imagery went with it. One widely repeated explanation comes from classical folklorist Adrian Mayer, who first proposed it in a 1989 paper in the journal Cryptozoology and expanded it in her 2000 book, The First Fossil Hunters. Mayer's hypothesis holds that Scythian nomads prospecting for gold across Central Asia encountered the skeletal remains of Protoceratops, a beaked, 4-legged dinosaur whose fossils are common in parts of Mongolia and China, and mistook the bleached skulls and bony frills for the remains of a lion-sized, beaked guardian. The fossil beds Mayer pointed to include the flaming cliffs of the Gobi Desert, first excavated by Roy Chapman Andrews for the American Museum of Natural History beginning in 1922, where Protoceratops skeletons still turn up exposed on the surface after wind erosion, precisely the condition that would let an ancient prospector stumble across one without digging. Books, documentaries, and museum placards ran with the theory for over 30 decades. It's genuinely disputed, though. In 2024, paleontologists Mark Whitten and Richard Hing at the University of Portsmouth published a detailed evaluation in Interdisciplinary Science Reviews and found the connection unconvincing. The known Protoceratops fossil sites sit hundreds of kilometers from any historical gold deposits. No classical text mentions bones or fossils alongside the griffin story, and griffin imagery appears in Egyptian and Near Eastern art centuries before Scythian nomads could have had contact with Mongolian fossil beds. What isn't disputed is that the fossils are real, common in exactly the region the legend points to, and strange enough on a hillside to draw attention from whoever found one. What's disputed is whether they came first, or whether the griffin already existed in Near Eastern art, and Scythian storytellers layered the gold guardian detail onto an older image. Either way, the legend's core detail is unusually precise for something built from nothing, a specific, consistent creature guarding a specific, real resource in a specific, real region. I keep coming back to how strange the consistency is. 2 people can disagree about almost everything else in the ancient world and still describe the same 4 details on the same creature for 400 years. That isn't what you'd expect from centuries of writers just inventing things independently of each other. Whatever inspired the griffin, it was guarding gold in a myth, not a body in a grave. Scandinavia took a darker approach. There, the guardian and the person it protected were the same corpse. Number 7. Draugr. The dead did not stay in their mounds. They came out swollen, physically strong, and violent toward anyone who touched what had been buried with them. Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th century but describing events centuries earlier, record specific encounters with corpses that kept fighting long after burial. In Grettir's saga, the hero Grettir breaks into a burial mound to face its occupant, a former warrior named Kar the Old, who has grown monstrous in death and attacks anyone who disturbs his grave goods. The saga insists Kar's body kept its full physical strength, rather than fading into a spirit, and that the mound had to be reclaimed by combat, not by ritual alone. Kar wasn't a one-off either. Eyrbyggja's saga describes a similar mound dweller named Torolf, who grows so dangerous after death that his farm has to be abandoned, and his body eventually exhumed, burned, and scattered at sea to stop him for good. Multiple sagas, and the pattern barely shifts. The dead retain physical strength, they smell of decay, they guard what was buried with them, and it takes violence, not ritual alone, to stop them. Old Norse even gave this figure its own name, Draugr, to separate it from a ghost or a spirit, a body, not an apparition. Archaeology backs up the fear. Neil Price, an archaeologist at Uppsala University who has spent decades studying Viking Age burial ritual, has documented Norse graves where weapons were deliberately bent or broken before burial. A sword folded in half, a spearhead snapped from its shaft. There's no practical use for that except a symbolic one. Breaking the weapon was believed to sever its bond to the dead owner's spirit, and it had the side effect of making the buried weapon useless to any grave robber willing to dig it up. Separately, archaeologists across Scandinavia have excavated a category of burials researchers now call deviant. Skeletons pinned beneath heavy stones, decapitated or buried face down, read as measures meant to physically stop the body from rising. Archaeologist Leszek Gardala, whose research culminated in a widely cited 2013 study on Viking Age deviant burial, has cataloged dozens of graves across Poland, Iceland, and Scandinavia where corpses were weighted with boulders, staked, or had their feet severed. Precautions like that only make sense against a body already assumed capable of getting up. The Oseberg ship burial, dated to 834 CE and excavated in Vestfold, Norway, shows the opposite response to the same anxiety. Grave goods rich enough, the thinking went, that the dead would have no reason to come back angry. So the sagas describe two different responses to the same fear: appease the dead well enough that they stay content, or restrain the body physically in case appeasement fails. Excavated graves show both were practiced, sometimes in the same cemetery a few meters apart. None of this reads like people burying their dead and hoping for the best. Bending a sword blade in half takes deliberate effort, with fire and a hammer, not a moment of panic. These were people who treated their cemeteries the way you'd treat a vault with a lock that might not hold. Japan skipped the dead body problem entirely. Its guardians were never corpses at all, and nobody had to prove they worked, because they never stopped standing.
Number 6. Komainu. Shinto tradition holds that paired guardian statues placed at shrine entrances keep evil spirits from crossing into sacred ground. One figure stands with its mouth open, the other with its mouth closed, together representing the first and last sounds of the Sanskrit syllable Om, beginning and ending, opening and sealing. Unlike almost everything else on this list, no archaeologist ever had to dig this tradition out of the ground to confirm it existed. The lion guardian concept traveled a long way before it reached Japan. It started with stone guardian lions placed at Chinese imperial tombs and temple gates during the Han and Tang dynasties, spread through Korea's Silla kingdom, and arrived on the Japanese archipelago from there. The form entered Japan by way of continental China and Korea, adapted over the Nara and Heian periods into a distinctly Japanese figure with its own name, Komainu, literally Korean dog. Surviving wooden examples of the Heian period, roughly 794 to 1185 CE, are preserved today in institutions including the Kyoto National Museum, some formally designated important cultural properties by Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs. The tradition never went dormant long enough to need rediscovery. New Komainu are still carved, commissioned, and installed at newly built shrines or renovated today, using the same paired open and closed-mouth design established over 1,000 years ago. You can't point to a single dig or a single excavator for this one, and that gap is basically the whole story. The Association of Shinto Shrines puts Japan's shrine count above 80,000, and most of the traditionally built ones have a paired Komainu at the entrance. Tens of thousands of these guardians are standing right now, out in the weather rather than behind glass, replaced when they crack and repainted when they fade, kept up by the same tradition that built the first ones. Stone took over as the main material during the Edo period, roughly the 17th through 19th centuries, replacing the earlier wooden figures and letting them survive outdoors for centuries at a stretch. A burial seals its guardian in with the dead. A shrine just rebuilds its Komainu every time the wood or stone finally gives out. Every other entry in this countdown needed a farmer's plow, a well digger's shovel, or a careful excavation before anyone could confirm it was real. This one never had to be found, because it was never lost. In Sardinia, a farmer's plow was exactly what it took, and even that didn't settle what the guardians it uncovered were actually for.
Number 5. The Giants of Mont'e Prama. Sardinian farmers had a name for the massive stone slabs scattered across the island's ancient tombs, tombe dei giganti, giants' tombs, because in their telling, nothing human-sized could have lifted them into place. That name had stuck to the landscape long before archaeologists ever excavated western Sardinia. The tradition held that the tombs needed guardians large enough to match whatever had built them. No written record from the island's prehistoric period survived to confirm any of it. The Nuragic people who built these sites left no texts of their own. It wasn't just one village's story either. Versions of the giants' tombs tradition turn up across the island wherever Nuragic megalithic structures survive, handed down through generations of farmers who worked that land with no framework to explain what they kept plowing into. The name stuck to the architecture for centuries. It never stuck to anything else. No statue, no bone, no physical giant ever turned up to justify it. Then, in March 1974, two farmers, Cicinio Poggi and Battista Meli, were plowing a field near the town of Cabras when their plow struck a carved limestone head. Excavation followed, led over the next several years by Sardinian prehistorian Giovanni Liliu and a series of collaborating teams beginning in 1975. What emerged was a set of limestone statues standing between 2 and 2.5 meters tall, up to 7 feet, roughly 1.5 feet taller than an NBA center, depicting boxers, archers, and warriors deliberately smashed into thousands of fragments and buried within a necropolis of cylindrical stone tombs. The tombs held the remains of young men between 13 and 50 years old, likely members of the same elite lineage. Restoration was almost the slowest discovery. Conservators at Sardinia's Lipunti workshop in Sassari spent decades piecing the shattered limestone back into standing figures, and several statues weren't returned to public display in Cabras and Cagliari until 2011, 37 years after the first fragment came up out of that field. New excavation campaigns beginning in 2014 have continued to recover additional fragments. More than 5,000 pieces have been cataloged to date. Dating places the statues in the late 9th to early 8th century BCE, made by the Nuragic civilization that had occupied Sardinia since roughly the 18th century BCE. The legend got the scale right. These are giant figures, oversized relative to the humans they were carved to represent, standing directly over a burial ground. What it never anticipated is that archaeologists still can't agree on why they were there. The leading hypothesis holds that the statues served as funerary guardians positioned above individual tombs, but the Metropolitan Museum of Art's own published analysis of the site notes the statues could just as plausibly mark a nearby temple structure that has never been located.
Most entries on this list eventually settle into some kind of answer, confirmed or contested, but at least argued over with evidence on the table. This one hasn't. 50 years after that first fragment came up, with thousands of pieces cataloged and multiple excavation campaigns behind it, the central question, guardian, monument, or something else entirely, is exactly as open as it was the day the plow hit that limestone head. Not every guardian tradition left behind stone this hard to read, though. In India, the guardians were never even meant to be frightening.
Number 4. The Yaksha. A guardian could be bargained with, not just feared. That was the entire premise behind the Yaksha. Early Buddhist and Vedic-era texts describe them as nature spirits assigned to guard something specific: a tree, a spring, a buried treasure, a gateway. Unlike most of the other guardians here, the tradition described them as approachable rather than purely hostile, capable of granting wealth and protection to travelers who showed them respect and punishing only those who didn't. Later Buddhist tradition folded Yaksha into the guardianship of stupas, the domed monuments built to house relics of the Buddha, positioning them at the gateways where pilgrims entered. The role recurs across centuries of religious literature spanning Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu tradition, with texts describing Yaksha guarding specific city gates, sacred groves, and monastery entrances. Yaksha iconography looks nothing like the menacing guardians covered so far. It consistently shows an open posture, a raised hand, an inviting expression, feet planted rather than lunging. The textual tradition treats them less as threats to fear and more as intermediaries to negotiate with. British archaeologist Alexander Cunningham surveyed the Great Stupa at Sanchi in 1851, and decades later, John Marshall, then Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, led its full excavation and restoration in the early 20th century. Carved Yaksha and Yakshi figures survive on the stupa's 4 gateways, or toranas, dated to roughly the 1st century BCE, shown in the exact open-handed posture the texts describe. One bracket figure on the stupa's eastern gateway, often called the Sanchi Yakshi, shows a female nature spirit grasping a branch of a flowering mango tree, her weight thrown into the bend of the trunk, an image reproduced widely in art history surveys as one of the most naturalistic figures to survive from ancient Indian sculpture. A separate and even more striking example, the Didarganj Yakshi, a polished sandstone statue over 2 meters tall, was discovered in 1917 on the banks of the Ganges near Patna, Bihar, and dated by most scholars to the Mauryan period, roughly the 3rd century BCE. Its surface still carries a mirror-like polish that modern craftsmen have struggled to fully replicate. None of the surviving Yaksha figures carry a weapon at all, which sets them apart from every arms guardian this countdown has covered so far. The texts described benevolent guardians, and the surviving carvings show exactly that: open hands instead of raised weapons, an inviting posture instead of a defensive one. Most guardian traditions had to be excavated to be confirmed. The Yaksha's core claim, that this guardian could be reasoned with, is visible directly in the stone, in how the figure is posed. The other guardians so far were built to keep something out through force. The Yaksha assumed the opposite was possible, that a guardian could be talked to. You can still read that claim straight off the carving today, in the body language alone, without a single written account to back it up. Egypt built its guardians on the opposite assumption entirely. A guardian's only job was to make sure no one ever got close enough to negotiate. Number 3. Anubis and the Ka guardians. Egyptian funerary texts describe the Ka, a person's life force, as something that needed a physical form to inhabit after death and needed protection from anyone who might disturb it. Book of the Dead spells instruct that guardian statues be placed at the entrance of the burial chamber itself, positioned to watch both the room and the doorway at once. The tradition specifies black and gold figures, standing rigid, 1 foot forward, holding a staff and mace. This was no minor funerary detail either. It shows up across dynasties of royal burial practice for over 1,000 years, adapted king to king, but never dropped. Almost none of it had survived to be checked though.
Tomb after tomb in the Valley of the Kings had already been broken into, stripped, and resealed by the time modern archaeologists showed up. The guardian statues, either smashed or simply gone. By the early 20th century, most Egyptologists had stopped expecting an intact version of this setup to ever surface. Then, on November 4, 1922, workers under British archaeologist Howard Carter, funded by Lord Carnarvon, uncovered a stairway in the Valley of the Kings leading to a sealed door. Behind it was the tomb of Tutankhamun, undisturbed for roughly 3,245 years. Flanking the sealed entrance to the burial chamber, Carter found 2 life-size statues of the king, black resin with gilded kilts and headresses, identified by inscription as the royal Ka. Exactly the arrangement the funerary text described, in exactly the position they specified. Egyptologists reading the statue's inscriptions have connected the color choice directly to funerary symbolism. Black evoked the fertile silt of the Nile and the promise of rebirth, while the gilding represented the imperishable flesh the gods were believed to possess. So the guardians were built to declare the king's transformation visually, not just to block the door. In an adjoining room, Carter also found a gilded wooden effigy of Anubis mounted on a gilded wooden shrine positioned to guard the tomb's treasury. The tomb's survival came down to circumstance rather than the guardian's effectiveness. Debris from a later tomb's construction accidentally buried the entrance, hiding it from the wave of robbery that stripped nearly every other royal burial in the valley. The texts promised guardians that would repel intruders. What actually protected Tutankhamun's tomb was a construction accident that hid the door for 3,000 years. The Ka statues survived not because they worked, but because no one ever got close enough to test them. Every other royal tomb in the valley with the same guardian arrangement was robbed anyway, often within a few generations of burial. Tutankhamun's is the exception, and it's the reason the whole tradition, the Ka statue, the Anubis shrine, the sealed door, is known to us intact at all, rather than a description in a text with nothing left to check it against. Egypt built its guardians to be found once by the right person and never disturbed again. Mesopotamia took the opposite approach and didn't bother hiding its guardians underground at all. It put them in plain sight, at the front gate, for everyone to see. Number 2. Lamassu. Assyrian building inscriptions gave us specific instruction, repeated across centuries of construction records. A winged, human-headed guardian was to stand at the entrance to the palace, positioned so nothing hostile could cross the threshold behind it. The text called these figures Shedu, or Lamassu, depending on the dialect and period, and described them as protective spirits given form in stone, capable of warding off disease, curses, and enemies alike. Ritual texts specified exactly where each guardian had to face and how many were required per gate. No single king or city gets to claim this one. Ashur-nasirpal II placed them at Nimrod in the 9th century BCE. Sargon II placed them at his new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, a century later. Sennacherib put his at the gates of Nineveh after that. 3 rulers, 3 capitals, all rebuilding the same guardian tradition off instructions handed down through generations of temple scribes. Excavation confirmed the pattern almost exactly as the text described it. French archaeologist Paul-Émile Botta began digging at Khorsabad, or Dur-Sharrukin, in 1843, uncovering colossal Lamassu still standing at the gate they were built for. Austin Henry Layard excavated Nimrod and Nineveh through the late 1840s, recovering dozens more. One Lamassu Layard recovered stands over 4 meters tall and weighs an estimated 30 tons, heavier than 5 adult African elephants, carved from a single block of gypsum. Each figure was given 5 legs rather than 4. Viewed from the front, it appears to stand still. Viewed from the side, it appears to stride forward. Several of Layard's finds were shipped to the British Museum, arriving in London in 1852. Pieces from Botta's excavation went to the Louvre. Cuneiform protective spells are inscribed directly into the stone at the base of multiple figures, matching the ritual function described in temple texts centuries before any of them were dug up.
The ritual text said the guardians had to face outward, flanking the gate on both sides, watching the road for anything approaching. That's precisely the position excavators found them in, some still upright after being buried under collapsed mud brick for over 2,500 years. Some gates didn't survive long enough to be measured, though. In 2015, militants destroyed the remaining Lamassu at the ruins of Nineveh with power tools, finishing in an afternoon what siege, fire, and 25 centuries of buried collapse had failed to do. Since then, the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities has worked with the Factum Foundation, using older photographs and 3D scan data to digitally model the destroyed Nineveh figures as a first step toward eventually recreating them on site. The Guardians, built to outlast every enemy the Assyrians could imagine, lasted almost 3,000 years against everything except a camera crew and a drill. In China, one emperor tried a completely different strategy. Instead of putting his guardians where everyone could see them, he buried an entire army where no one would ever think to look. Number 1. The Terracotta Army. An emperor prepared for his death the way he prepared for his conquests. Sima Qin, the Han Dynasty historian, writing around 94 BCE, roughly a century after Qin Shi Huang died, recorded that the emperor ordered a mausoleum built so vast it would keep him ruling in the next life exactly as he had ruled in this one. The chronicle describes rivers of mercury flowing across a bronze floor, a ceiling inlaid with constellations, and crossbows rigged to fire on anyone who broke in. It says nothing about an army standing guard outside the tomb. For 2,000 years, that silence held. Farmers around Mount Li, near the city of Xi'an, occasionally struck fragments of fired clay and bronze while digging wells or plowing fields, and passed them off as remnants of an old kiln or scattered temple debris. No local record connected these fragments to the buried emperor a few hundred meters away. The tomb itself, protected by imperial law and later by simple neglect, was never opened, and the story of what surrounded it stayed exactly as incomplete as Sima Qin had left it. Then, on March 29, 1974, a farmer named Yang Chi-fa and 5 relatives were digging a well in a drought year when they struck a life-sized clay head. Zhao Kongman, curator of the nearby Lintong Museum, arrived within days, identified the fragments as Qin dynasty military figures, and began piecing them back together by hand. A full archaeological team started excavating what's now called Pit 1 that July. What they eventually uncovered ran to more than 8,000 individually detailed soldiers, along with horses and wooden chariots, arranged in battle formation across pits covering roughly the space of 3 football fields. Every soldier's face is different, distinct hairstyles, expressions, even ear shapes, modeled on real infantry rather than a single template. A third pit, smaller and set apart from the main formation, holds just 68 figures arranged around a command chariot, thought to be the army's headquarters rather than its front line. In 1980, excavators recovered 2 half-scale bronze chariots near the tomb mound itself, complete with silver and gold fittings. Conservator Katharina Blensdorf, working with the Bavarian State Department for Cultural Heritage since the 1990s, has spent decades developing techniques to stabilize the original lacquer paint, which curls and flakes away within minutes of exposure to open air, meaning most excavated soldiers have already lost the vivid color they were buried in. In 2005, soil analysis by Chinese researchers found mercury concentrations around the still unopened tomb mound far above natural background levels, close to the pattern Sima Qin described nearly 2,000 years earlier. The central burial chamber remains sealed. No one has opened it. The tomb's own inscriptions never promised an army. They promised protection. It turned out protection took the shape of 8,000 individually carved men standing between the emperor and whatever intended to reach him. The mercury the emperor wanted flowing through his tomb, according to the record, is still there, still detectable, and still the reason archaeologists have chosen not to open the burial chamber with current technology. Most guardians on this list needed someone to dig before they could be confirmed real. This one still has a door nobody has been willing to open in over 2,000 years. 8 guardians, 8 cultures built from clay, limestone, gypsum, wood, and stone across more than 4,000 years of history that never once shared a language or a border. Most of them had to be dug out of a hillside, a wheat field, or a sealed doorway before anyone could confirm the legend matched something real. One of them in Japan was never lost at all because the people who built it never stopped rebuilding it. I don't think that's a coincidence so much as the same instinct showing up 8 separate times on 8 cultures that had no contact with each other and no reason to copy anybody else's answer. There's still Mercury sealed under a hill outside Xi'an, untested, still doing the one job its emperor asked of it 2,000 years ago. If you want to see more, click the video on screen.